You are listening to Protegimus, a Henry Knox story, written by Pete Briggs and narrated by J. Forrester. Chapter 1. The town of Oldham wore its despair openly, the scars of time and indifference etched into every brick. Each terraced house along the battered streets bore the marks of neglect. Countless windows were boarded up, hiding hollow interiors from both prying eyes and thieving hands. Soot-stained chimneys, the relics of a once thriving industrial age, now pointed toward a perpetually sullen sky. Amid this decline, Henry Knox navigated a battered former military Land Rover Wolf 110 down a forgotten mill-town street, the growl of its tired engine echoing like distant thunder, an elegy for a place on the brink. The green and black vehicle, scarred from its own service, fit seamlessly into these desolate surroundings. Finally, Henry parked outside a dilapidated terrace house whose facade was peeling, the flaking paint like skin over old wounds about to split, revealing the deep marks of time and disregard. Knox swung open the Land Rover's door, the heel of his boot hitting the ground with a solid thud. A cold wind nipped at his face, lacing the air with the chill of a long-forgotten grave. Standing over 6 feet tall, his stocky build commanded the narrow street, lending him an unmistakable air of authority. Salt and pepper hair framed a broad forehead, and his angular, square jaw was softened only by the deep-set blue eyes that swept the area with the trained vigilance of a seasoned soldier. He wore a dark t-shirt, combat trousers, and polished Altberg boots, the same practical uniform he'd carried over from his military days. Henry had seen much in his life, from the poverty-stricken streets of his youth to the deserts and war-torn villages he'd traversed in service of his country. Now he fought a more elusive war, one waged for personal survival and moral justice in these neglected pockets of civilian life. His private detective agency, Knox Investigations, operated from the same Land Rover now parked outside the derelict terrace, was a comparatively new venture, a calculated risk of being employed outside of service without a boss. Even though business had been slow, Henry's resolve had been strong and unwavering. In the forces, persistence had always reaped results. He hoped it would now, but he had found quickly that being outside the army's safety net left him feeling exposed and alone. As Knox moved toward the door, the street seemed to hold its breath. A suffocating silence pressed down, and the air felt stale, as though all life had been wrung from it. Somewhere in the distance came the slow, rhythmic thud of a bass drum, like the fading heartbeat of a dying town. When he reached the door handle, rust flaked beneath his fingertips. The metal felt unnervingly cold, as though the house itself had succumbed to the surrounding lifelessness. Henry knocked, his closed fist sounding a sharp, echoing note that pierced the hush like a death knell. The door rattled under the impact and drifted slightly ajar. Splintered wood ringed the lock, and the hinges looked warped, barely clinging in place. Someone had kicked this door in more than once. Knox took a step back, scanning the length of the streets. The signs were everywhere. Cracked doors, bent frames, broken locks. This was no isolated incident. The entire neighborhood looked systematically torn apart. A war zone, Knox thought grimly. These feeble doors never stood a chance. Whoever was responsible had done it with brutal intent. A gust of wind tugged the door open with a groan, drawing Henry's attention back to the threshold just as an elderly man emerged from the shadows. The man's face was carved with deep lines, each wrinkle telling a story of hardship. A thin halo of silver hair clung to his temples, the last traces of youth refusing to vanish entirely. He gripped the door frame with trembling hands, his hesitant movement hinting at frailty. Yet, despite the cloudiness of early dementia in his eyes, A momentary spark of recognition ignited when he saw Knox. Knox kept still, taking in both the man's posture and the dimly lit interior behind him, waiting for something, anything, to crack the silence. Henry's mind flickered back to the phone call that had led him here. Earlier that morning, he'd been sat in the driver's seat of his Land Rover parked in a quiet corner of a public car park. His mobile vibrated against the dashboard, and an unknown number glowed on the screen. "Knox Investigations," he answered in his usual guarded tone. The voice on the other end was tense, laced with desperation.
"Mr. Knox, my name is Leela Alderson. I'm calling about my father, George Alderson. He lives alone in Oldham."
Her voice caught, the weight of distance pressing through the line. "Go on," Henry prompted, instantly alert.
"I live in Canada, and I can't get home right now," she explained. "My dad, he's in the early stages of dementia, and some thugs have started targeting him. They robbed him, and now they keep harassing him. He's terrified, and I don't know what else to do. I need someone to help him. Please, Mr. Knox, can you help? I'll pay whatever it takes."
The urgency in Leela's voice had struck a nerve. Her plea for help tugged at Henry's sense of duty, that same protective instinct that had guided him through years of service. "I can do that," he said, the decision as natural as breathing. "I can be in Oldham within the hour." Leela exhaled, a shaky sound of relief bridging thousands of miles.
"Thank you, Mr. Knox. He lives on Kipling Street, number 10. I really appreciate this."
The old man's voice drew Henry back to the present.
"Mr. Knox, thank heavens you've come,"
he murmured, his tone a fragile thread of relief and despair. He gestured for Henry to enter. Stepping aside, Henry's gaze swept over the modest hallway, overturned framed photographs with shattered glass, broken furniture strewn about, the silent aftermath of repeated vandalism. This frail man, George Alderson, had been living in constant fear, tormented by local youths whose brutality seemed to mirror the decay of the entire neighborhood. Moving farther along, Henry first caught the sharp odor of fresh paint, which struck him as odd, as George clearly hadn't hired any decorators for some time. Then he grimaced at the foul, acidy stench that threatened to overwhelm him. He scanned the corridor, and his gaze landed on the wall near the living room door, which was marred by ill-spelled graffiti and jarring red spray paint. "Tommy's Boy." The lettering sloped unevenly, each character clumsier than the last, and below it, the carpet was discolored and stained with urine. George's disheveled appearance spoke volumes. He looked as though he'd given up on basic self-care, likely made worse by his daughter's absence. The house itself resembled a drug den or an abandoned squat, and Henry couldn't dismiss the idea that squatters might actually have been here at some point. It was obvious George needed far more help than just warding off thugs, but Henry resolved to tackle one problem at a time. George shuffled deeper into the hallway, toward a room that Henry assumed was the living room. His steps were heavy with age and vulnerability. As Henry followed, George spoke in a trembling voice. "They took everything worth a penny," he said. "Even my wife's jewelry. She passed away 2 years ago. Those pieces were all I had left of her." He turned to Henry, grief shining in his cloudy eyes. The raw pain in George's words made Henry bristle with anger. He placed a reassuring hand on the old man's shoulder. "I'm here to help, George. Tell me exactly what happened." The living room might once have been respectable, perhaps in the 1980s. Now torn floral wallpaper clung to the walls, and a scattering of Pendelphin ornaments occupied a row of dark wooden shelves beside an electric fire. A pungent smell of mold hung in the air, prompting Henry to wonder when the heater had last worked. George lowered himself into a small rocking chair, its worn wooden frame creaking under his weight. It was the only piece of furniture still largely intact, though its surface was nicked and faded. The rest of the room lay in ruins, broken chairs, splintered tables, and slashed cushions spilling their foam after years of neglect and vandalism. Henry surveyed the wreckage, thinking about Leela. She had clearly been away too long, and it seemed unlikely she knew the true extent of her father's living conditions. More likely, George had hidden just how dire things had become, either out of pride or stubbornness. George gestured for Henry to sit. Scanning the debris, Henry settled on a three-legged stool braced against the battered wall, precarious but serviceable. Perched there, he listened intently as George recounted each attack he could remember. Most followed the same grim pattern. While George spoke, Henry's mind methodically mapped out a plan. He needed to set a trap that would catch these predators off guard and put a stop to their terror.
"The ringleader's the worst of the lot," George went on, his tone growing bitter. "A nasty piece of work called Tommy. He pushes the others to come at night, riding those bloody electric bikes."
Henry listened, mentally cataloguing each detail. Gangs like Tommy's might be small time, but they could easily serve as conduits for bigger, more dangerous players, often without knowing it themselves. In his experience, street-level crime rarely stood alone. It was usually just one branch of a far more twisted tree. "Tonight," Henry said powerfully, filling the room with bravado, in an effort to raise George's spirits. "We'll make sure it's the last time they terrorize you, George." A wavering smile lit George's face, and for a moment he looked decades younger. Henry couldn't help but smile back. Part of him would have done this job for free, but he knew he couldn't afford that. His fledgling PI business was barely scraping by, and most of his post-discharge work had been mundane marital surveillance. This, at least, would demand a different skill set, something more tangible than snapping photos of an unfaithful spouse. Henry began a thorough sweep of the house, mentally cataloguing every door and window. This place reminded him of countless other terraced homes he'd seen, the ones he'd grown up in his own small northern town. After finishing his interior checks, he moved on to the front and back streets, studying the stone cobbles and potholes for potential escape routes. He wasn't worried about his own exit. He wanted to know exactly where these vandals might run. He kept a low profile as he wrecked the area, aware that his military bearing made true anonymity unlikely. People tended to notice him no matter what, sensing the authority in his stride. Still, he doubted the gang would roll in during broad daylight. It didn't match their established pattern, but that didn't mean he'd relax his guard. Old habits die hard, especially the ones that keep you alive. Satisfied with his methodical, thorough checks, Knox withdrew, mentally confirming that he'd left no loose ends. Certain of his plan, he moved the Land Rover from outside George's property and parked it beneath a soot-darkened stone viaduct. He set his phone to silent and dropped it into the central cup holder, then draped a green tarp over the vehicle retrieved from a side bin. Knox's Land Rover was more than just transport. It was his home, his office, and his constant ally on the road. In the rear, where seats should have been, black kit bags were stacked, each stuffed with clothing, equipment, and gear for whatever life or work might throw at him. Side bins held more specialized equipment, flashlights, first aid kits, a portable stove, everything he needed to live rough if necessity demanded it. He had slept in there more nights than he cared to recall, lulled by the drum of rain against the metal roof. Now the Land Rover was to be concealed beneath a towering 19th century stonework that threw a deep shadow. As always, Knox parked in reverse. He'd learned long ago that backing in made for a faster getaway, a crucial advantage if trouble arose. His motto was straightforward: prior planning and preparation prevents piss-poor performances, colloquially known in the military as the 7 Ps. Satisfied that his prep was complete, he settled into position, well hidden, leaning on the bonnet with his elbows. Now it all became a waiting game, and Henry had patience in spades. He wasn't in a hurry. A good stakeout demanded calm and careful observation. As dusk blared into bruised purples and deep blues, He readied himself for whatever the night might bring. Chapter 2. Secreted beneath the shadow of a train track arch, Knox remained stalwart and focused. The dusk had morphed into night, the light of the short day being chased away by the dark shadows of winter. His eyes pierced the frigid air, staring from within a deep and dark recess. From his position, Henry had the perfect view of Kipling Street, where the terraced houses stood in their tired, crooked lines. The old industrial town stretched out in a stark, unrelenting grid, its streets meticulously designed to serve the insatiable hunger of the industrial machines of old. These rigid arteries converged on vast blackened factories and smoke-belching mills, their towering chimneys dominating the skyline. Once these streets had thrived with life, men and women trudging to work, children darting between the shadows of progress. But now they stood largely empty, shadows of a past shaped as much by toil as by the relentless rhythm of the machines they served. The train lines and mills had been the town's lifeblood, the chimneys belching black smoke into the sky. Now those chimneys were as lifeless as the factories they served. Most had been torn down or converted into supermarket forecourts, leaving only their ghosts to loom over the town. Everything else had decayed, including the people. The night hummed with a nervous quiet, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Every distant sound, a scrape of metal or a soft murmur, crackled in Henry's ears, keeping his focus razor sharp. He could feel the street alive beneath the stillness, holding its breath. It did not take long after the streetlights flickered to life for the first hum of electric bikes to cut through the evening's calm, signaling the arrival of the expected gang. Knox took note of where the bikes had come from. That would be their escape route. These guys were not trained like the military. They would not know to alternate their routes to avoid setting patterns, and they would not know that they were driving into an ambush. The gang swept into view, moving with the arrogance of predators who had never known fear, their coarse laughter breaking through the night's quiet like a mocking taunt. They moved past Knox without a flicker of awareness, their noise and bravado shielding them from his sharp eyes that tracked their every move from the darkness. They turned into the street fronting George's house, their jeering voices carrying a sinister promise, oblivious to the silent shadow that watched their arrival. The first to dismount was a lanky teen with a shock of bleached hair. He jumped from the bike, which skidded into a parked car and shuddered to a halt before flopping on the ground. He ran straight into the door with his shoulder, and the door burst open easily. The light in the hallway of George's house breached onto the flags of the pavement in the front door. 3 others ran in, giggling after the blonde-haired teen. All 3 kicked the door of the doorframe as they entered the house. A lone skinny male in his late teenage years stood guard on the bikes, but he was not doing a decent job of being a lookout. He was too busy shouting at the others and trying to pry into the house. He was laughing and pointing. Knox, like a ghost, departed his cover, taking a straight line from the train arch directly to the front door of George's terrace house. The teen, too preoccupied by how much fun the others were enjoying, failed to take notice of the dark figure that approached quickly and quietly behind him. As Knox approached, his mind ran through the tactical considerations of striking the opponent in front of him. He knew well that his hands, while indispensable for many tasks, are poorly suited for delivering effective blows. Many inexperienced fighters rely on them, swinging wildly, hoping for impactful contact. Often, they land a punch low on the knuckles, resulting in broken metacarpals in these smaller protuberances, which bear the brunt of the impact. These bones are weak and prone to breaking under stress. Knox's own hands bore the marks of such early errors, scars, and even old teeth marks from fights long past, stories of a time before Knox knew how to hit someone correctly. In his seasoned experience, Knox preferred using parts of the body built to withstand and administer force. The heel of the hand was ideal for this purpose. It allowed for a swift, sharp jab, quick and controlled. The padding of the heel absorbed some of the shock, minimizing the risk to himself while maximizing the damage to his opponent. A bent elbow, too, was a formidable weapon that could deliver a devastating blow in close quarters. The power concentrated into a small, brutal impact area, although it meant you had to get in close, sometimes too close to the enemy. Additionally, the apex of the head could serve as a powerful battering ram, though it required a precise close engagement. The hard bone of the skull could inflict considerable damage, especially in a clinch where distance and space were limited. Knox considered these options as he prepared to neutralize the threat swiftly and efficiently with minimal fuss and maximum effort. Henry studied the gang member quickly. The kid was not large, but knocking him out cleanly required precision. Henry's target was the subtle indentation where the skull meets the spine, an ideal spot for incapacitation without a high probability of causing too much permanent injury. After all the calculations and permutations, Knox settled on a simple jab despite his reservations. He would just need to execute the blow with precision, which he performed perfectly, delivering a well-aimed strike to the soft juncture at the base of the kid's skull. Knox's fist connected with a solid thud, the satisfying resistance of flesh and bone telling him his timing had been perfect. The force vibrated up his arm, a jolt of power that grounded him in the moment, controlled, sharp, and purposeful. He used just enough power to ensure the boy would be knocked out. The impact sent the kid stumbling forward, and his body slackened. Henry caught him before he hit the floor. He swiftly dragged him out of sight, away from the doorway, and gently laid him down in the recovery position. A quick pat-down revealed a flick knife in the kid's pocket. It was a basic model, about 4 inches long, with a cheap plastic handle designed to mimic wood. Henry quickly used the knife to disable the gang's escape route, methodically slashing the tires and brakes of the 4 bikes parked nearby. With the immediate threat neutralized and their transportation sabotaged, he snapped the knife's blade to prevent its reuse and dropped the remains into a road grate. Knox silently moved forward to the side of the doorframe and peered into the barely lit hallway. It was empty. He could hear glass being smashed somewhere in the house, and there was the faint sound of a spray can being used, probably more graffiti on the walls. Henry's face was stern and focused as he stepped over the threshold for the second time that day. Henry advanced with a predator's caution along the wall of the dimly lit passageway. Fresh, wet streaks of red paint trailed down the opposite wall, slowly seeping downward in the bleary, fluorescent glow. Henry's familiarity with the house's blueprint was now his ally. To his left was the living room door. There was no light to betray the intruder's location, but the muffled sound of metal striking metal told Henry one of the gang members was inside. With a burst of speed, Henry surged into the room. He kept low, minimizing his silhouette against the faint illumination from the hall, an instinctive tactic to prevent giving the youth any chance to react before it was too late. However, his stealth was unnecessary. The gang member was engrossed in his destructive task of kicking the electric fire free from the wall. At the last moment, Henry's movement caught the corner of the intruder's eye, and as he turned, Henry seized the moment, using the heel of his hand. He propelled forward, targeting the spot just under the youth's chin. The impact was sharp and sure, a direct hit that sent vibrations through Henry's straight arm. The youth's body buckled under the force, collapsing as swiftly as if strings had been cut. Henry caught the limp body before it could crumple noisily to the floor, guiding the unconscious form down with the same meticulous care as the first, the soft descent barely disturbing the air, allowing the silence to hold and his ambush to remain perfectly intact. Henry positioned the second young man in the recovery position, carefully adjusting his limbs so that he was stable yet securely incapacitated. As the youth lay motionless on the floor as if asleep, the stillness filled the room. Henry took a moment to listen. He closed his eyes, his senses heightened, and he could almost hear the heartbeats of everyone in the house. He listened intently, focusing on the locations of the remaining gang members. One was in the kitchen and one upstairs. The element of surprise remained firmly on Henry's side, a tactical advantage he was not about to squander. With a couple of gang members now neutralized, the balance of power had shifted significantly, but Henry knew that overconfidence now could prove costly. He allowed himself a small smile. 2 down, and 2 to go, he thought. The only other room downstairs was a large kitchen which had been updated around 1975. From the sound of the crashing Henry could hear emanating from the room, it suggested that the decor was being drastically remodeled. Henry's entrance into the room was swift, and as he rounded the corner, he came face to face with a figure caught in the stage between adolescence and adulthood. The youth, no older than 20, wore a dark tracksuit and a conspicuous thick gold chain that looked too large for him, draped around his neck. The youth's eyes widened in shock, and he immediately registered the presence of an intruder. Fear spread quickly across his face, transforming into stark terror as he processed the sudden and threatening disruption to his evening. In a fluid, instinctive motion, Henry thrust a sharp jab into the youth's midsection, aiming just below the ribs. The punch landed with a solid crunch, effectively driving the breath from the young man's lungs. Gasping for air and unable to scream or even shout, he stood frozen for a moment, clutching his stomach, the shock of the blow and the abrupt loss of oxygen rendering him momentarily helpless. The kid doubled over, clutching his midriff, struggling to catch his breath. Knox did not hesitate. With a quick, brutal movement, he drove his elbow into the top of the youth's head, sending him crumpling to his knees, unconscious. Out of habit, Knox caught the boy's head before it could collide with the hard, tiled floor, avoiding a loud thud that would give away his position. Stealth was no longer necessary. With the majority of the gang dealt with, only Tommy remained, and Knox wanted him to know that he was the last one standing. Henry walked up the steep stairs and turned onto the landing at the top, heading toward the sound that came from the front bedroom. The light flickered brightly from the main bedchamber as the noise of breaking pottery and glass continued. Knox stood at the entrance to the room, filling the doorway with the breadth of his shoulders, his head slightly bowed, forehead leaning forward, eyes focused on the prize. He raised his fist and knocked on the doorframe. "Ding dong," he said without a hint of a smile. He was enjoying himself. A tall young man with gangly arms and bleached blonde hair stood in the center of the room. This was clearly Tommy. He spun, suddenly alert and startled, toward the door, a broken chair leg held as a makeshift weapon in hand, his eyes wild with fury and confusion. "Who the fuck are you?" he shouted wildly. "Where is George, the little black twat? I wanted to say hello." "I'm the new landlord, Tommy. George is under my care. He is nice and safe. Unlike you," Knox replied in monotone. Tommy smiled, his broken yellow and brown marked teeth on display. "You know my name, old man. But do you know who I am?" Henry shook his head. "Nope, and nor do I care. What I do know is this is the last time you come to this house. This is the last time you trouble George." "You in whose army?" Tommy laughed. "My dad is Ronnie Marshall. I'm sure you've heard of him. He will cut you open from belly to balls if you lay a finger on me." "I will take my chances, Tommy," Henry replied flatly. "You have one chance. Leave now and never come back, or your dad can come around and take you home in an ambulance." Tommy, blind with fury, ignored the warning and hurled himself at Knox, spewing threats. Henry moved with the grace of experience, sidestepping the reckless swing of the chair leg and then ducking effortlessly beneath the backswing. In one fluid motion, Knox struck back, his hand moving with brutality. He drove the heel of his hand upward into Tommy's jaw, and the unmistakable crunch of bone or teeth breaking filled the air. Tommy's head snapped back, his body folding as his legs buckled, sending him crashing silently to the floor. Henry moved quickly, checking his pulse before gently rolling him onto his side. A thin line of blood trickled from Tommy's mouth, but his airway was clear. Henry quickly patted Tommy down, his hands deftly locating a mobile phone tucked away in the young man's pocket before using Tommy's thumb to unlock the device. Scrolling through the contacts, Henry searched for an entry labeled Dad or similar. His eyes narrowed as he spotted two possible numbers. One was simply listed as Dad, but the other had a distinguishing detail, Ronnie in brackets. He called the number and pressed the phone to his ear, waiting for the call to connect, his gaze fixed on Tommy's prone form, vigilant for any signs of stirring as he prepared to confront whoever was on the other end of the line. A couple of rings later, a gruff voice came on. "What the fuck do you want?" Knox calmly asked. "Is this Ronnie?" "Who the fuck are you?" the voice on the other end of the phone shouted, clearly irate. "I am waiting for you at George's house. Pop down when you have 5. We need to talk about how to parent your kids." Knox ended the call, his grip loosening on the phone as he let it slip from his fingers, the device bouncing off Tommy's forehead with a muffled thud before clattering loudly on the hardwood floor. Henry turned the room light off and moved to the large bedroom window. He stood motionless, his broad frame cloaked in the darkness of the room. His eyes locked on to the view outside the window, scanning the deserted street below. The world felt unnaturally still, the quiet broken only by the distant hum of a car passing close by and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. Under the flickering glow of the streetlights, shadows danced across the scattered pavement below, casting eerie patterns around the discarded bikes strewn across the road, left in haphazard disarray by the youths in their rush to unleash chaos. In the blackness, Knox waited for Ronnie. Chapter 3. Knox's gaze remained fixed on the corner of the street where the gang had first appeared. That was where Ronnie Marshall would come from. It was the only logical approach. Knox knew Marshall would not even consider deviating from his normal path, the one his gang had ritualistically followed. It did not matter if Marshall pulled up in a sleek symbol of wealth or a battered thugmobile. Knox had dealt with too many men like him to care. Within minutes, the low growl of engines sliced through the night air, amplified by the concrete canyons of the terraced buildings, announcing Marshall's arrival with an arrogance that dared anyone to stand in his way. What Marshall had not foreseen, what he could not have imagined, was that the route he had meticulously carved out for his gang was now the very path that delivered him to Knox, placing him squarely in the crosshairs of danger. The roar swelled, growling into a snarling beast that tore apart the silence. Knox caught the flicker of headlights breaking through the far corner's shadows. He leaned forward, every muscle tightening as a heavy, expensive car barreled into view. It tore down the street with reckless abandon, skating on the black tarmac as it slid to a sharp halt directly in front of George's house. Knox took a large and deep breath through his nose and stepped back from the window. The frayed curtains swayed slightly, enough to obscure his silhouette, but not his view. "Showtime," he muttered under his breath. Knox's hands remained relaxed. There would be time enough for them to tighten into fists, but there was no point in expending that energy now. Instead, he waited and watched the unfolding drama below. Ronnie clearly had an eye for theatrical entrances. This was not merely an arrival, it was a show of power, an entrance meant to unsettle, to scare, to dominate. This tactic might work on the weak and vulnerable, on frail old men cowering in their homes, but not Henry Knox. Ronnie Marshall was not intimidating to him. If anything, he was confirming Knox's expectations and letting him know the game was on. The high-end BMW gleamed under the streetlights, its polished exterior an ostentatious beacon in the middle of desolation. Knox studied it carefully, its sleek frame out of place amidst the crumbling, rust-streaked vehicles that littered the street. The doors flung open, and 3 large men stepped out, moving with deliberate power and deadly purpose. One swung a baseball bat casually in his hand, while another held a large machete, its blade flashing ominously in the dim light. The third man, lagging slightly behind, spoke in low, commanding tones, his calm, authoritative presence a clear indication that he was in charge. Henry's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene unfolding before him. It was clear who Ronnie was. The authoritative stance and the effortless way he commanded the situation left no doubt about his leadership role. He watched as Ronnie, with a calm yet commanding presence, gestured to his associates, signaling strategic positions in front of George's house. Inside, Henry's mind worked rapidly, years of hard-earned experience allowing him to size up the situation in an instant. He knew he needed to act with both speed and precision. The arrival of the men, wielding a baseball bat and a machete, signaled a significant escalation. They were ready for violence. The element of surprise had tipped slightly out of his favor, but Henry was not fazed. The game had shifted, but he believed he still held the winning hand. Henry quickly ran through a series of scenarios, calculating the most effective strategies for neutralizing the threat while keeping himself out of harm's way. Experience had taught him that bullies were best dealt with through swift, decisive violence, and that they needed to understand exactly who was delivering the punishment and why. There were not many options at his disposal, but Knox did not need many to finish the job. Henry stepped away from the window and walked slowly down the stairs along the slim hallway to position himself squarely at the house entrance, his figure framed by the weak hallway light that spilled out onto the street. His shadow stretched long and foreboding across the pavement, an ominous silhouette that seemed to expand and darken as it extended further from his feet. The stillness of the evening was pierced by the soft, insistent murmur of neighborhood curiosity, a quiet hum that rippled through the air like an unspoken question. Knox noticed the subtle movements of the curtains in the windows up and down the street. The neighbors, drawn by the sound of screeching tires and loud voices, peeked out of shadowed windows to catch a glimpse of the unfolding drama. Yet, none dared to step outside. The tension in the air, coupled with the intimidating sight of the 3 armed men, kept them securely behind their broken doors, their presence marked only by the occasional twitch of a curtain. Knox, aware of the eyes watching from the safety of their homes, stood unflinching. He was a lone figure against the backdrop of a quiet suburban fear, ready to confront whatever was about to come his way. He kept his posture calm and relaxed, but in his mind, he was on alert. These men were not here just to make up numbers. They were Marshall's muscle, and they liked to dish out pain. He needed to be focused and ready. Knox waited for the men to approach him, a power play. This was his ground, and he was not about to give it up easily. All 3 men appeared to be in their early to mid-40s, with large, stocky builds, the uniformity of bald heads shining under the streetlights. Their expressions were set hard like slabs of granite. They wore crisp white tracksuits and gleaming trainers that screamed designer labels. As Knox readied himself mentally, the largest of the trio, a brute of a man clutching a baseball bat, charged forward. His face was twisted in a grimace of unbridled fury, veins bulging at his temples as he bellowed threats. The bat, held high, sliced through the air, an extension of his rage aimed with reckless intent as he bore down on Knox. Henry could feel the weight of his anger, the sharp crack of his voice splitting the quiet of the evening.
"I'm gonna fuck you up, you little shit!"
Knox assessed his opponent with a cold, calculating gaze. The big man, all muscle and anger, gripped the baseball bat like a warrior wielding a broadsword. Knox knew a typical swing with such a heavy weapon would be slow, laden with momentum. Although the bat could also be jabbed forward as a poking weapon, the man's fury hinted at no such finesse. He was primed for a crushing blow. Predicting the arc of the impending swing, Knox prepared his counter. His response was swift and lethal. A coiled spring inside him suddenly released, and he surged forward with explosive agility, closing the distance before the man could commence his swing. Knox jumped forward and drove his crooked elbow hard into the man's forehead. The connection was solid, the impact resonant, echoing slightly in the quiet street. This time there was no attempt by Knox to ease the man's descent. He let the aggressor crumble where he stood. The bat clattered out of his grasp, hitting the pavement with a wooden thunk that cut sharply through the night air. Stepping back smoothly into the light of the doorway, Knox reclaimed his original stance. His voice, calm and low, broke the brief silence that followed the thud of the falling body. "Next," he said quietly, as his eyes flicked to the next threat, ready to engage once more. The two remaining men hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances as they absorbed the swift downfall of their companion. The air thickened, the moment stretching as they calculated their next move. Ronnie broke the silence with a sharp command, his voice laced with frustration. He directed the man holding the machete, who, up until now, had been a looming figure in the background, to advance on Knox. The machete wielder faltered, his initial movements hesitant and jittery. Fear flickered across his face, the turmoil swirling within him. He had witnessed how decisively Knox had dealt with the first attacker, and the memory of his colleague crashing to the ground haunted him. Yet, the weight of loyalty, or perhaps even fear of retribution from Ronnie, forced him to stay and fight. He knew on which side his bread was buttered, and with a resigned sense of dread, he edged forward, compelled by his boss's stern orders. Despite his reluctance, the machete wielder's advance was a clear signal of compliance. His grip tightened around the handle of his weapon as he wrestled with his fear, stepping into the fray with shaky determination to fulfill the role Ronnie demanded of him. Knox stood firm, his expression unreadable as he observed the reluctant machete wielder's approach. The scene before him was painfully familiar, like a cliched script from a worn-out action movie, one he had seen replayed countless times. Bullies like Ronnie, who orchestrated violence from a distance, relying on the fear and loyalty of their underlings to enforce their will. Knox knew this game well, and he knew how it ended. Knox again relaxed his shoulders, rolling them to drop tension from his stance, his eyes tracking every tremor of hesitation in the machete-wielding man's approach. Knox was ready, his mind and body synchronized in anticipation. He knew that for George and the rest of the street to be free of a man like Ronnie Marshall, they needed more than a few broken bones and black eyes. The entire cycle of intimidation and fear had to be broken. But first, he had to deal with the machete wielder, who was drawing closer. Knox prepared to end the scenario on his own terms, ready to dictate the conclusion of this all-too-familiar plot once again. The second attacker had not learned from the mistakes of the first. He believed that the weapon in his hands was the deciding factor of this confrontation. He lunged with reckless aggression, the machete slicing through the air in chaotic, untrained swings. It was obvious he lacked any real finesse, but that hardly mattered. A machete did not need precision to be deadly. Its sheer weight and size could tear through flesh with ease. Yet, for all its destructive power, the weapon needed room to operate, and Knox had no intention of giving him that space. As with the baseball bat and the chair leg Tommy had brandished, the real chance lay in the split-second heartbeats between each wild swing, the moments when the attacker left himself dangerously exposed. Henry waited for that perfect heartbeat, then struck with a flawless combination of timing and technique. He sidestepped under the wild charge, moving fluidly, sharp and quick. As the attacker barreled past, Knox delivered a perfectly executed clothesline, using the man's own momentum to amplify the force. With a smooth, calculated step forward, Knox added his weight to the move, maximizing the impact. The forearm strike caught the assailant flush in the face, his body whipping backward from the force. Knox, maintaining control and momentum, forced the man downward, directing his fall. Knox made sure of the collapse by sweeping the attacker's feet out from beneath him, and he crashed to the ground, his head striking the tarmac with a sickening thud. The sound of soft flesh and hard skull meeting tarmac echoed in the quiet street, a grim punctuation to the swift takedown. The man lay motionless, his body limp on the ground. Knox dropped to a kneeling position across the man's arm, the hands still tightly clutching the machete. Henry's breathing was steady, controlled. He forced the machete clear of the hand and threw it backwards toward the house, placing himself between the blade and the attacker. He raised his head to scan the scene for further threats, sensing Ronnie's next move even before it happened. Ronnie had attempted to flank Henry, but his eyes, his posture, and every hint of muscle tension had telegraphed his plan to deliver a brutal kick at Knox's head. It was exactly what Knox would have done in his place, exploit any advantage to keep an opponent down. But Knox was prepared. As Ronnie's foot arced towards him, he reacted quickly and mercilessly. His left hand rose, not simply blocking but actively deflecting the kick to disrupt Ronnie's flow. Simultaneously, his right hand caught the lower part of Ronnie's leg, his grip firm. Using Ronnie's extended leg as leverage, Knox surged upwards to his full height, pulling Ronnie off balance in one smooth, forceful move. The sudden shift left Ronnie vulnerable and exposed. Seizing the moment, Knox drove his elbow with the full weight of his body behind it into Ronnie's groin. The blow was devastating. Ronnie's body crumpled, his knees buckling as he fell to the ground, clutching himself in anguish. Knox stepped back, watching dispassionately as Ronnie writhed, pain and nausea overtaking him while he vomited bile, his body curled into a fetal position. Calmly, Knox reached down and rifled through Ronnie's pockets, extracting the car keys with a swift tug. As Ronnie, driven by pain and desperation, made a weak attempt to grab at Knox, Henry responded instantly. His fist connected sharply with Ronnie's face, the sound of breaking bone mingling with the sickening splash of blood and vomit on the tarmac. Now Ronnie had a broken nose as well as the agony in his groin. As Knox straightened, keys in hand, the doors of nearby terraced houses began to open cautiously. Residents who had been long intimidated by the gang's presence peered out. Relief flooded their faces, mixed with a sense of tentative freedom. They had been living under a shadow of fear, and now, seeing their tormentor-in-chief lying helpless and defeated, they felt a surge of hope. But even as the neighborhood began to stir from its forced silence, Knox knew the night's work was not over. The gang had been crippled, but the deeper issue that allowed such terror to thrive remained. Knox looked down at the incapacitated Ronnie, a plan forming in his mind, ready to address the problem at its root. This was a small victory, but it was far from the end. Ronnie would crawl back from under his rock the moment Knox was gone. Tonight, it needed to be finished for good. Knox used the key to unlock Ronnie's BMW, a sleek machine coated in glossy black, its polished exterior an ostentatious beacon of ill-gotten gains. The luxury car was equipped with modern features, financed by the proceeds of crime. Henry slid into the smooth leather of the driver's seat, the material cool and supple beneath him. He reached out and pressed down the ignition button. The engine responded with a low, assertive rumble, far different from the Land Rover's ignition, Knox thought. The BMW logo illuminated the dashboard display, quickly giving away to the sophisticated menu system. Knox navigated to the map application and scanned for the recent locations. Knox exited the car and approached the incapacitated Ronnie. Despite the groans and weak resistance from the beaten gang leader, Knox dragged him to the rear of the vehicle and used the key fob to pop open the boot before heaving Ronnie inside, ignoring his weak protests with clinical indifference. The boot slammed shut loudly, echoing down the street. Knox returned to George's house, where Tommy still lay unconscious from their earlier confrontation. Knox hoisted Tommy's limp body onto his shoulder with a grunt. He maneuvered down the stairs and through the narrow hallway, out to the BMW parked ominously outside. Opening the back door, he bundled Tommy into the back seat, securing him by wrapping the seat belts around him so he would not tumble during the ride. Comfort was not a priority, security was. Knox double-checked the restraints, making sure everything was tight, then closed the door with a solid thud. Knox then settled into the driver's seat, closing the near side door behind him. He glanced once more in the rearview mirror, ensuring everything was as it should be, then released the handbrake with a definite click. His foot pressed firmly on the accelerator, and the BMW responded at once, gliding forward into the obscurity of the night. As he drove, Knox skimmed the display screen, searching for the map feature. Once he found it, he scrolled through the past destinations. Locating the right one, he set it as his target, and the screen mapped out his route. Knox continued by tapping a second icon on the touchscreen, a green square with a white phone receiver, and used the keypad to dial 999. He reported the break-in at George's house and the injured gang members, making sure to cover all bases in case the neighbors had hesitated to make a call themselves. The drive to the destination was short and uneventful. The lockup was a nondescript building situated just off the main road, isolated and quiet, away from prying eyes. As Knox parked, he could hear faint banging from the boot, a reminder that Ronnie Marshall remained inside. He chose to ignore it for the moment, his focus on the task at hand. Knox stepped out of the car and headed toward the lockup. Knox pressed the button on the key fob, making the garage door of the lockup rumble open, revealing the dark interior that soon exposed the unsavory secrets of a criminal empire. The cramped space was filled with a trove of contraband. Shelves were laden with drugs, the air thick with their chemical scent. Equipment, likely stolen from countless unknown victims, lay stacked haphazardly against the walls, and racks of counterfeit designer merchandise gave the place the garish look of a rogue's market. In the midst of the chaos, a solitary box sat on a battered table, its contents spilling over with wads of cash, presumably the gang's recent spoils, hastily left as Knox's orchestrated diversion had lured them away. Knox's eyes lingered on the money for a moment before he methodically began pocketing the notes. Turning his attention to the unconscious Tommy in the back seat, Knox gripped him by the arms, dragging him across the cold concrete floor with a resolute tug. He positioned Tommy next to a table cluttered with more incriminating evidence, including a bag of white powder perched on top. With a firm push, Knox propped Tommy against an old chair, watching as the youth's head lolled forwards, lifeless in unconsciousness. As Tommy's head hit the table, a cloud of white powder erupted into the air, particles dancing in the beam of a solitary light bulb overhead, casting ghostly shadows on the walls. Knox stepped back, surveying the scene with satisfaction. Now for the final touch. Henry walked back to the car, his footsteps echoing slightly in the quiet of the deserted area. He pressed the button to unlock the boot, bracing himself for what might follow. As the lid swung open, he was met with a scene of unexpected chaos. Ronnie had not stayed idle. The back seat was shredded by his desperation and fingernails, torn leather wood and foam revealing the man's frantic attempt to escape or produce a weapon. As soon as the boot swung open, Ronnie lunged forward, his fear and fury boiling over. His hands shot out, desperate to clamp around Knox's throat in a final effort to overpower him, but Knox was ready. He knocked the grasping hands aside and, without hesitation, delivered a crushing blow with the heel of his hand into Ronnie's face. The strike was overwhelming. If Ronnie's nose had not already been broken, it certainly was now. The unmistakable crack of bone and flesh echoed through the night like a shot, the violent sound slicing through the stillness. Ronnie's momentum and the force of the punch sent him reeling backward, his body going limp as he lost consciousness mid-lunge. He collapsed back into the boot, a heap of defeated muscle and malice. Knox gripped Ronnie by the ankles, dragging the unconscious man out of the boot and across the dirt-streaked floor. His body scraped lifelessly behind him as Knox reached a large crate, its contents hidden beneath a loose tarp but obviously part of the drug cache. Knox grabbed a bungee rope coiled nearby and swiftly wrapped it around Ronnie's wrists, securing him to the crate. The binding was firm, ensuring there was no chance for Ronnie to escape once he woke up. After ensuring Ronnie was fully immobilized, Knox returned to the sleek interior of the BMW. He leaned over to the integrated display screen and dialed 999 once more, where he reported the sounds of gunfire at a lockup before leaving the line open so the dispatcher could hear the ambient sounds of the lockup. Distant traffic, the soft groaning of the restrained Ronnie. Using a rag from the car, Knox wiped the vehicle down, ensuring the screen, steering wheel, and any surfaces he had touched were clean. He pocketed the rag and left the car, distancing himself from the direct chaos he had orchestrated. Looking back, the lockup glowed with security spotlights, illuminating the scene with the intensity that reminded him of Blackpool illuminations. Finding a spot in the shadow of a narrow back street where he felt most at ease, Knox maintained a clear view of the lockup. A blend of satisfaction and anticipation brewed within him, knowing the police were only minutes away. He had set the scene meticulously, almost theatrically, to get exactly the attention he sought, ensuring the final act played out as he imagined. Suddenly, the night air was punctuated by the distant wail of sirens growing louder, the sure sign of the police's imminent arrival. Soon, the blue flashing lights of 4 police cars cut through the darkness, converging on the lockup. The officers spilled from their vehicles, moving swiftly. They approached the open garage where Ronnie lay unconscious, tethered by bungee ropes before a pile of stolen paraphernalia. Tommy was also quickly found, slumped and unresponsive, covered in white powder and surrounded by bags of drugs. Knox could not help but smile faintly from his vantage point. The police arrival, their quick action, and the abundance of evidence laid out so clearly must have felt like a windfall for them. A criminal jackpot unwrapped in the early hours of the morning. Christmas had come early, if only by a couple of days. Within minutes, the area was alive with more police units. It felt as though half of Greater Manchester Police had descended upon the lockup. Officers moved in and out of the illuminated garage, faces bright with smirks as they recorded evidence and coordinated efforts, each eager to participate. They seemed aware of the massive impact their find would have. With the scene now awash with police, Knox slipped back to where he had parked his Land Rover, concealed in the shadows. Removing the tarp that hid his vehicle, he packed it away. He opened the driver's door, feeling just how old the Land Rover was compared to the BMW, and reached into the central cup holder for his phone. The screen lit up, displaying numerous missed calls, all from Catherine, his estranged wife. Puzzled, Knox hovered his finger over the callback icon, then swiped the notifications away and dialed George's number. After a few rings, George answered in a cautious but relieved voice. "Hi, George. Can you meet me at your house? We're all done here," Knox said, his voice carrying quiet assurance. Minutes later, George stepped out from a neighbor's house, his pace hesitant as he approached Knox. The front street was teeming with police officers and ambulances, chaos abounding. Yet across all that carnage, George smiled at Henry, relief and gratitude lighting his face, clearly showing that he had witnessed everything. "Your problem is sorted," Knox greeted him briskly, sparing details. "They won't bother you again, but I'd suggest finding a safer place to stay for a while." George glanced sadly at his home, his eyes clouding with emotion. "It was the only house we ever owned, me and my wife," he murmured, the weight of memory apparent in his tone. Knox nodded sympathetically. "The police found the stash of stolen goods. Hopefully your belongings are among them. It might take a while, but with luck, you'll be reunited with what they stole. A flicker of hope lit George's eyes as he thought about possibly recovering his wife's jewellery.
Oh, my wife Gina would be pleased to have her things back. Have you seen her?
He asked, his voice laced with a mix of hope and confusion as he surveyed the street looking for her. Knox offered a sad, knowing smile, choosing his words carefully to avoid more painful truths. This might come in handy, he said, handing George a stack of banknotes. There should be enough here for you to move to Canada and stay with your daughter for a while. Gripping the money, George's eyes glistened with tears.
Leela would love that,
he whispered, overwhelmed by the gesture and the prospect of safety. Stay somewhere safe tonight and enjoy the money, Knox advised, giving George a final pat on the shoulder. Then, turning, he walked back to his vehicle, leaving the night's turmoil behind him. Knox felt his phone buzzing in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, which displayed a bright message against the darkness.
We need to talk. I'm on my way back to the UK today. Call me.
The message was from Catherine. His stomach lurched. She had been silent for weeks. Why was she suddenly returning to Britain? Knox puzzled over the text before switching the screen off and sliding the phone back into his pocket. That was another problem for another day.